All right, we are going to do chapter 18, section 2 of World Studies. So we looked last week at the causes of World War II. There were lots of them. Spread of dictatorships and their aggressive actions, the inability of democratic nations to stop those aggressive actions, the legacy of World War I, and ultimately the invasion of Poland by Germany started World War II in Europe, and then Japan's aggressive actions toward the United States with Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war in 1941. So we're going to look at the course of the wars. What are some of the main events that took place? Now, keep in mind, we could spend the entire school year talking about World War II. We really could. We could do that with any of the topics in history. There is so much depth to what we could cover. So this is a summary. We're going to hit some of the major points. There is a lot more that you could look at, though, with World War II. So if it's a subject that interests you, I recommend you get out there and read. Because there's lots of great stuff out there for World War II, and that's appropriate for your age group as well. There's lots of children's literature on World War II. All right, so first of all, I mentioned this last time, but World War II really was a world war. Battles occurred on several different continents, and nearly 60 countries participated in the war. So we're going to look at the different theaters of conflict. That might be a turn of phrase that you're not familiar with. A theater of conflict, it's where the battles are playing out, where the action is happening. And World War II had several different theaters of conflict, places where the action was taking place. So first of all, we have the Western European theater of conflict. So the Western European theater of conflict. So if you recall from last week, before the war got started, Germany had incorporated Austria, it had taken the Rhineland, it had taken Czechoslovakia, and then it had invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. In 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. You should be familiar with this because Denmark is where Number of the Stars takes place. So you should already know that Germany invaded Denmark in 1940 and Norway at the same time. Next, the same year, they attacked the Netherlands and Belgium. So if you have a map near you, and if you don't, your textbook, page 335, has a map that's going to show a lot of these countries. They're just really taking all the surrounding countries of Europe, taking them on. The British and the French responded to all these attacks by sending troops to Belgium to try and stop the German forces. But the Germans had anticipated they would do this and were able to sweep past the Allies into France. So the effort to try and stop the Germans in Belgium failed, and the Germans go right from Germany through Belgium into France. Now remember, France is one of the major Allied countries at this point. So they're invading France. Within 1 month of invading France, the Allied army found itself trapped near the English Channel on the beaches of Dunkirk. They made a movie about this invasion at Dunkirk a couple years ago. Again, can't really recommend it for you guys. I think it might be rated R. But nonetheless, it is a significant historical event that they've made a movie about. So, beaches of France. You should have the map near you, because if you're not familiar with European geography, France and England are very, very close to each other. England is an island, but there are certain points where they're very close. So the city of Dunkirk is on the French coast, pretty close to England, right there on the English Channel. And so the Allied army had all been pushed there to the coast and were trapped, and the Germans surrounded them. Hitler planned, he had them there. They couldn't really go anywhere. Hitler planned to have the German Air Force, which is called the Luftwaffe, wipe out the Allied forces from the air. He was going to have his Air Force come in, bomb them, take them out. But one thing Hitler couldn't control was the weather. So because there was a lot of fog and rain and low cloud cover, it meant that his Air Force couldn't see clearly to do the maneuvers they needed to do. And so the air attacks were postponed for 9 days, and those 9 days allowed an opportunity for these Allied troops to get out of Dunkirk. So it's incredible what they did. They used British citizens in their boats to help save the troops. British citizens were able to ferry the trapped troops across the English Channel to safety in Britain. So it wasn't the British military primarily that rescued the troops. It was common British citizens that had fishing boats that literally took their boats across the English Channel, got these troops, and took them back to England. So although the Allies were able to escape destruction at Dunkirk, and Dunkirk is really quite an amazing story and clearly shows God's hand in what happened there, because no one thought those troops were going to make it out alive. And even though they did make it out alive, the Germans had still won the battle. They had chased them out of the area. They had to leave defeated. They didn't defeat the Germans. They saved their lives, but they didn't win the battle. And that allowed Germany to occupy France. The British troops had to leave, and so France became occupied by Germany. So even though France was an ally, now France is occupied by Germany, and they're no longer fighting with the Allies. So at this point, this is 1940, that kind of leaves Britain all by themselves fighting against Germany that has conquered all of this European territory. So Hitler's going to move on to Britain next. Hitler began a bombing campaign against Britain to prepare for a land invasion. So Hitler takes his air force, the Luftwaffe, and they just relentlessly bomb London and England to weaken them so that then the Germans could come and invade them by land. It was a scary time to be living in England, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, if you've read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but that's the backdrop to that is the children in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They were fleeing London because World War II was taking place, and where they lived in London was being bombed heavily, so they left to go live in the country where they would be safer. So the Luftwaffe not only bombed military targets, but they also targeted cities and civilians in order to destroy the British morale. Think about last chapter. What would we call this? The fact that they were not just trying to bomb the military, but taking out any part of the town or city that they needed to accomplish their goals. I'm hoping you thought of total war, because World War II, just like World War I, was a total war. So even though they're trying to bomb the British to reduce their morale, make them feel like they're defeated, it had the opposite effect on the British. It actually strengthened their resolve to defeat the Germans. They were not happy with being treated this way, and it made them really want to defeat the Germans. And so it didn't do what the Germans thought it would. They just began to fight harder. All right, so that was the Western theater of conflict. That's not all we're going to talk about as far as battles there, but that's just the beginning of the war, as Hitler was quickly taking over all these countries and gained France as a territory. All right, so there's also fighting going on in Eastern Europe as well. Just a few days after the Germans had begun their invasion of Poland, Russia also invaded Poland. I mentioned that to you last week, that poor Poland, and we've talked about Poland before. Poland's constantly being broken up by other countries. They just couldn't catch a break, couldn't keep their independence for long. So Germany invades Poland, defeats them pretty quickly. A few days later, Russia comes in from the opposite side, from the east, and so Germany and Russia are kind of sharing control of Poland at this point. The Russians also seized the countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Your map, if you still have your map out, 335, doesn't really show them. Oh yeah, it does show them to you. They're right there underneath Finland. So the Russians are also, they're a communist country, and they're taking control of a lot of areas at this time too. So we're going to talk specifically now about Russia, or the Soviet Union as it now was referred to. Despite the fact that Germany and Russia had previously signed a peace treaty, so even though Hitler didn't like communists, he had decided to sign a treaty with Russia and say, we're not going to get into a fight with each other. We're going to stay out of each other's business. But even though they did that, Hitler in 1940 began making plans to invade Russia. Now, think back to earlier in the school year when we talked about France and Napoleon. Does anyone remember what I said about invading Russia? Does not end well usually. Okay, didn't end well for Napoleon. It's not going to be a good decision for Hitler. Man, this was a bad decision for Hitler. So Hitler decides to go against his peace treaty with Russia and makes plans to invade Russia. And the German attacks on the Soviet Union began on June 22nd, 1941. So this is prior to the United States entering the war, but it's after Germany has already taken a good chunk of Europe as his own. So he's now set his sights on Russia. Even though the Germans achieved many victories against the Russians, it seemed good for a while. Just like with Napoleon, the extreme winters in Russia prevented the Germans from being able to advance to ultimate victory. They weren't used to the extreme winters. They couldn't continue to move. The snow stopped them. They weren't equipped, and so they were not able to ultimately succeed against the Soviet Union. And you can imagine that now they've made a big enemy, and the Soviet Union is going to end up fighting alongside the Allies, an unlikely ally of Britain and eventually the United States, but one that definitely was helpful in defeating Germany. All right, so we've talked about East and Western Europe. Now there was also the North African theater of conflict. Italy saw how Germany was able to conquer most of Europe, and they decided they were going to try to do the same thing in North Africa. So again, geography, keep it in mind if you've got your map open. You might not really realize this in your head, but Italy is very close to Northern Africa. Northern Africa is right below Italy. And so they saw Germany spreading out in Europe. They're like, well, we're going to take over Africa then. Germany can have Europe and we'll control Africa. And they had already taken Ethiopia and Albania, which is European, but kind of southeastern European. All right, so the British army are going to fight in Africa as well to try and stop Italy. So the British army was able to get rid of the Italians from Egypt and capture over 100,000 Italian troops. So they're having some success in Italy at stopping them. But Hitler and Mussolini with Italy are allies, and so Hitler is going to come and defend Italy in the spring of 1941. Hitler sends his general Erwin Rommel along with highly trained German troops to Africa to try and defeat the British in Africa. Rommel almost did defeat the British, but in 1942, British General Bernard L. Montgomery finally defeated the German forces in Egypt. So the Italians and the Germans are fighting, but the British do succeed in defeating the Axis powers in Egypt in 1942. All right, there's also war going on in the Pacific too, out in the Pacific with the Asian nations. After the attack on Pearl Harbor that we talked about last week brought the United States into the war, the Japanese attacked many islands throughout the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur became the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific. So, Allied commander, okay, so Britain, at this point United States, Soviet Union, they were primarily fighting Europe. They're fighting not only Germany, but also Japan and Italy. So MacArthur is United States general, and he becomes the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific. He's the main one in charge of coordinating attacks against Japan in the Pacific. There were two major battles in 1942 that ended Japanese expansion. So we're still pretty early, well, I guess 1942 is about halfway through World War II. Oh, but it's not the ending of the war by any means. So one battle took place in the Coral Sea, northeast of Australia, when American planes destroyed many Japanese ships. So the American Air Force was able to destroy a lot of the Japanese ships out there in the Coral Sea, which stopped Japan a little bit from continuing to expand. And then a month after that, Americans discovered that the Japanese planned to attack Midway Island, which was a place kind of midway between, I believe, between Japan and Hawaii, maybe? Yeah. So it was a naval base for Americans, and so they learned that the Japanese were planning to attack them there, but because they learned about it ahead of time, they were able to get the upper hand. So even though the Japanese forces were far larger than the Americans attacked first because they got the knowledge ahead of time and forced the Japanese to retreat. So both of these defeats put the Japanese at a disadvantage earlier on into the war. All right, so we are going to look at some major turning points that took place during World War II. This is where we're going to really hit some of the major events. So there were hundreds of battles and events that occurred during the Second World War. We could never look at all of them in this class, but we're going to look at some of the key decisions that were turning points in the war. So a turning point is where something major happens that affects the ultimate outcome of the war, allows one side to maybe have an edge over the other. All right, so we've already touched on this here, but it is a major turning point. Germany's invasion of Russia, which caused Germans to face a two-front war. So Germany breaks their peace treaty with Russia, invades them. Now they've created another enemy, another member of the Allies, the Russians. And now Germany is fighting a two-front war. That means that they have enemies both to the east and to the west of them. They're having to send their resources both places. That puts them at a disadvantage. Another turning point that we talked about last week, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Both of these things happened in 1941, just a few months apart. Well, yeah, 3-4 months. That brought the United States into the war. That was a key turning point because remember, Russia was just barely before that starting to fight on the side of the Allies. France was controlled by Germany, so Britain for a while was basically fighting alone. And so even though it wasn't a good event for the United States, it was a good event for the war on the whole because the United States was brought into the war, which helped give the Allies more support. All right, when the U.S. declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, Italy and Germany also declared war on the U.S. We've got that alliance ripple effect happening, which brought America also into the European theater of war. So America is not only going to fight in the Pacific, they're also going to help the British fight in Europe, and that's important. The British needed help. Under the leadership of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, you maybe are familiar with that name, you perhaps should be because Eisenhower becomes a United States president after the war. But during this time, he was the main general in the European theater of war. So in Africa. He was the main American general in Africa. So we already talked about how under the British leadership of General Montgomery, they were able to fend off the Germans and Italians from Egypt. Well, with the help of the Americans under the leadership of Eisenhower, the Allies, the British, and the Americans were able to completely defeat the Axis powers in Africa in 1942. So the African theater of conflict basically ended in 1942. And then from there, in 1943, Eisenhower led troops to defeat Italy. So World War II does not end till 1945, but Italy is taken out of the battle and is no longer fighting on the Axis side by 1943. So that's a major turning point. So the next important decision after they defeated the Axis powers in Italy and Africa was for the Allies to invade Europe. They need to make a major land attack to take back this territory that Hitler had gained in Europe. And so, after much planning, on June 6th, 1944, the Allies launched a major invasion of France along a 50-mile stretch of 5 beaches in Normandy, and this has become known as D-Day. So if you remember from last week, the picture at the beginning of my PowerPoint, I asked you if you knew what it was. It was a picture of the D-Day invasion. This D-Day invasion is very significant. Think about it though, it's June 6, 1944. The war is gonna end less than a year later. The war has already been taking place for almost 5 years. And then, so it took almost 5 years for the Allies to execute and plan this land invasion of France. And remember, they're invading France because France is occupied by Germany. France was initially fighting on the side of the Allies. They want to be liberated, but Germany controls France. So they invade on the beaches of Normandy, and this is known as D-Day. D-Day is just a military term that they use as code for a big battle day. So there have been many D-Days throughout history, but this is, when you say D-Day, this is what people think of. It's the most significant D-Day. All right, we're gonna come back to this slide, but really quick, I wanna show you some pictures and talk to you about the D-Day invasion. So this, I think, is a similar picture to what I had in the beginning. So the troops were coming in off the ships across the English Channel to the shores of France. Now, the shores at Normandy in France, they don't look like our beaches. They have these huge cliffs. Okay, now this picture is a picture that I took when I was actually in Normandy myself on a World War II history class trip. Not with my students when I was a student. When I was in college, I took a trip for 2 weeks, and it was a class on World War II, and we went all over Europe, tracing basically the Allied soldiers from the Normandy invasion. So think about what they're facing here. They're coming up on the shores. This territory up on you can't really see my laser pointer, can you? This territory up here, these cliffs, this is all controlled by Germans. There are Germans and German fortified areas where they're sitting, waiting, guarding the shore, all up here. How are you going to approach this and take that over? They have the advantage of height. They can just look down on you and shoot you. And that's a lot of what happened. So a lot of these soldiers they were facing death coming in. It was a very daunting task. And so this picture here, I don't know how well you can really see this, but if you see all these little dot looking things, those are actually etched shapes of bodies. They do this every year to commemorate what happened at Normandy and on D-Day, to signify all of the lives that were lost. And if you can, I don't know how well you can see it again, but it's really just covered with the shapes of human bodies. Thousands of bodies were left on that shore dead that had been shot. But amazingly, we did succeed at invading at that point. Not everyone was killed. We also had Air Force coming in, the 101st Airborne Division coming in to help attack, and it was a horrible, horrible battle, but we succeeded in taking some ground, and from there we were able to continue pushing forward into France and gain some territory back from Germany. So D-Day is an incredible thing to think about and study, that attack, and the bravery that was needed for those soldiers is incredible. All right, so so the fighting in Europe would continue for another year, but this successful invasion sealed the defeat of Germany. So Germany, because they're fighting a two-front war, you can only go on so long taking over. They're starting to weaken, and the fact that the United States and the Britain now are working together and were able to invade at France and continue pushing forward, this basically sealed the fact that eventually Germany would be defeated. It was just a matter of when. So by 1945, American forces had captured the 2 islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in Japan. So back to the Pacific theater of war. So because they captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they were able to use those as bases from which they could bomb Japan and end the Japanese war. So the final turning point of the war was when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. This is probably something you're familiar with as well, and we'll discuss that later on in the chapter, the details of those bombs, but that was kind of the final ending point of World War II, was when we dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. So I know that was a lot of information on that slide, but those are just some of the major turning points happening, and we're going to actually look at a couple things a little bit in more detail here. All right, so let's look at the specific battles and events that really brought the conclusions. We've already kind of seen it in brief at the turning points, but we're going to look in more detail here. So the conclusion of the war in the European theater. By December 1944, so remember, D-Day was June 6th, 1944, so 6 months later, by December, the Allies had reached the border of Germany. So they've moved through France into Belgium. But Hitler ordered one final push in order to break through the Allied defenses. So he's not giving up easily. This failed attempt became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The battle was given this name because of the bulging shape of the German offensive line. So let me show you what I mean here. Sorry. So this is a picture of what the Battle of the Bulge, the military formation. So this line here is the German front, and they're pushing against the Allied troops here. So we've got Germany and Belgium. Okay, you can see the German offensive, they're pushing and fighting against the Allies, took this kind of all bulging shape. And so that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. Some pictures here again, I don't know how well you can see them, but this is me standing in the Ardennes forest where this Battle of the Bulge took place in Belgium, Bastogne, Belgium. What's amazing about this, so this was in December, so it was winter in Europe, cold, snow, and the Allied soldiers, or really the Germans probably too, but the Allied soldiers especially, they're out here fighting for their lives, fighting for their country, fighting for the freedom of Europe in the middle of winter, and they are building these foxholes. So again, I don't know how well you can see this, but a lot of these foxholes that they built back in 1944 are still in the Ardennes forest in Belgium today. And so I was able to go and see some of the remnants here of these foxholes. This is me standing in front of a very large foxhole that was built. So that's so cool. And it's crazy to think about. Think about this is, you're in here living for days on end fighting the Germans out in snow. It was snowing, and they're sitting in these holes with their guns, trading watch on and off, having to fight in that environment. It's incredible. All right, so that was the Battle of the Bulge. It was kind of Hitler's one last attempt to defeat the Allies, but it failed. It did not succeed. The Allies won. And so in the spring of 1945, so that was December, so now we're moving into the next year, spring of 1945, the Allies waited west of Berlin, that's the capital of Germany, and allowed the Russians to fight their way into Germany's capital from the east. So the Russians actually are the ones that come in and take Berlin first. On April 30th, 1945, knowing that it was only a matter of time before Germany would have to surrender, Hitler committed suicide. So kind of a cowardly thing to do in a way. Didn't want to face the reality of being defeated. He knew that he would be probably executed, definitely executed, for all of his war crimes, and he didn't want to face that, so he committed suicide. As far as I know, I believe that he and his wife at the time, took cyanide pills, but then I think he also shot himself and her for like a double make sure we're dead type scenario. I don't, yeah. They took cyanide pills as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure there's evidence that they may have shot themselves too. But he commits suicide. Now Germany doesn't have a leader, so it's really just basically the war has been won, but there were some final battles that took place. So on May 7th, a week later, the Germans unconditionally surrendered. They had no leader anymore, and they knew they were defeated. And May 8th, 1945 was declared VE Day. That stands for Victory in Europe by the Allies. So the war in the European theater ended May 8th, 1945, but the war in the Pacific was still going on. And some of the soldiers that had just fought in the Battle of the Bulge and gone through all of this, some of them went to the Pacific after this to continue fighting. All right, so that's the conclusion of the European part of the war. We looked at that. Now, Japan, the Pacific. How is the Pacific gonna end? In April 1945, so this is right around the time when things are coming to an end in Europe, President Roosevelt died. He had been in office for 12 years. He had a disease called polio. He actually was in a wheelchair, which interestingly, the American people at the time did not even know because they don't have TV like we do today. So radio and they didn't even realize that about the president, but he dies. And his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes the president of the United States in April 1945. In July 1945, the European war is over, and so the Allies want to wrap it up and they want to end the whole war. They want to get out of the Pacific too. So in July 1945, the Allies demanded that the Japanese surrender or suffer terrible consequences. So they give them this ultimatum: you surrender now, or we will bring down the full force of the United States military on you. It's not going to be good. Well, the Japanese don't surrender. If you remember, way early in the school year, we talked about their practice of harakiri, how it was considered honorable for them to commit suicide rather than surrender to the enemy. So that's not really in the Japanese character to want to surrender to the enemy. So the Japanese refused to surrender. President Truman made the decision to drop an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, I've heard it pronounced both ways, on August 6th. So this is a tool that had been developed by Albert Einstein and other scientists and had never been used before. This is the first time an atomic bomb was developed and used on an enemy. So Hiroshima gets bombed with an atomic bomb, huge loss of life, but Japanese still refused to surrender, and so the US dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. After these two devastating atomic attacks on August 14th, the Japanese government finally surrendered. Their only request was that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to remain in his position, because for the Japanese, it's more than just a government position. The emperor in the Shinto religion is viewed as a god, so it was important for them that he was allowed to remain in his position. So the Japanese and Allies officially signed the documents to end the Japanese involvement in World War II on September 2nd, 1945, which is now known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan. So May 8th, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe. A few months later, September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day, Victory in Japan, and World War II is over. All right, so that is the course of the war in a very quick, may have not felt quick to you, but all things considered, 6 years of war. That was the highlights, or the lowlights, I don't know. It was the key parts of the war. So the next section, the last section of the chapter, section 3, is on the consequences of the war. You may have seen my slide. We're going to talk about a consequence of the war, which was happening during the war, which was the Holocaust, and you're already a little familiar with it from reading Number the Stars. We're going to talk about that in more detail, and we're going to talk about what happened in the world after World War II ended, just like we did with World War I. After World War I, there was a Great Depression, so what happens after World War II? But before we get to section 3, you need to take a quiz on chapter 18, which will cover some things from both sections 1 and 2. So you've got to take a quiz. That'll be in Nearpod, or you can email it, and then you can move on to section 3, and then that'll be the end of the chapter.